They handed me a speech, 12 pages, written by someone else, signed by no one, and they expected me to read it word for word in front of the entire United Nations General Assembly. It was an apology, not a statement, not a clarification. An apology for standing up, for defending my people, for saying the truth about Israel, France, and the silent war being waged on the African continent. They told me, just read it, President Traoré, for diplomacy's sake. They said, this is how we maintain partnerships. They said, you'll be isolated if you don't. But I didn't come to the UN to make friends. I came to represent a people who've been silenced for over 400 years. So I folded their script in half, and when I stepped up to that microphone, I brought my own words, words that shook the chamber. It all started with my speech 2 months ago, the one they said went too far. In it, I called out what Israel and its allies were doing in Gaza. I said that the cries of Palestinian mothers echoed just like the cries of mothers in Mali and Congo and Niger. I said that if Africa remained silent, then we were complicit. That speech didn't sit well with the so-called peacekeepers. A week later, I received an official letter from the UN Secretary General's office. It said my remarks had caused diplomatic tension and undermined regional cooperation. They asked me to appear before the Assembly, not to speak freely, but to clarify my position. Let me be clear. They didn't want a clarification. They wanted a confession, and they didn't stop there. Calls came in from Paris, from Washington, from Tel Aviv. Back channels were activated. Offers were made. Threats followed. We can reconsider development aid if you're willing to walk it back. We understand your position, but surely you don't want sanctions. Then the final blow. They drafted a speech for me. 4 pages apologizing for tone. 3 pages apologizing for language. And 5 pages reminding me to reaffirm our shared values. Whose values? Because the last time I checked, our values didn't include silence in the face of genocide. I could have stayed home. I could have ignored the invitation. But I knew what this moment meant. If I didn't speak, they'd rewrite the story. If I didn't show up, they'd say I backed down. So I flew to New York, with no script, no apology, and no intention of bowing. But before I tell you what happened in that chamber, let me tell you about the week leading up to it. Because that's when I discovered just how deep their panic really went. 3 days after I received their drafted apology, my phone rang at 2 a.m. Not my official line, my personal phone. The one that only 5 people in the world have access to. A voice I didn't recognize said, President Traoré, this is Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department, we need to talk. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the presidential palace. No flags, no diplomatic plates, no advance notice. Ambassador Richardson stepped out with 2 men who never introduced themselves. Mr. President, he said, settling into my office without invitation, we have a problem. He opened a leather briefcase and spread documents across my desk. Satellite photos of Burkina Faso's gold mines. Financial records of our newly negotiated Chinese infrastructure deals. Intelligence reports on Russian military advisors we'd never officially announced. We know everything, he said quietly. And right now, we're choosing to call it economic cooperation instead of what it really island. I leaned back in my chair. And what do you think it really is, Ambassador? The beginning of something that could make your country very uncomfortable. He wasn't wrong. For 6 months, we'd been quietly restructuring every major international partnership. Chinese engineers were redesigning our telecommunications network. Russian agricultural experts were revolutionizing our farming techniques. Iranian pharmaceutical companies were building medical facilities that would make us self-sufficient in basic health care. Not because we hated the West, but because we'd learned that dependency is just slavery with better marketing. Richardson continued, that speech you're planning to give at the UN, it doesn't have to be confrontational. You can make your point while keeping your partnerships intact. I looked at him for a long moment. Ambassador, let me ask you something. When your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize to the UN first? That's different. When France intervened in Mali, did they ask African permission? The situations aren't comparable. When Israel bombs Palestinian schools, do they draft apology speeches? Richardson closed his briefcase. President Traoré, you're a smart man. I hope you'll make the smart choice. After they left, I called my security chief. How many Western intelligence operatives do we currently have under surveillance in Ouagadougou? 17 confirmed, probably double that number we haven't identified yet. And how many of our phone lines are they monitoring? All of them. but we've been feeding them false information for 3 months. I smiled. Good. Tomorrow I want you to leak a story that I'm having second thoughts about the UN speech. What kind of second thoughts? The kind that suggest I might actually read their apology. My security chief grinned. Understood, Mr. President. Because here's what Richardson and his masters didn't understand. I wasn't just planning to reject their script. I was planning to expose why they'd written it in the first place. The next morning, Western embassies across Africa began receiving reports that President Traoré was reconsidering his approach and seeking ways to rebuild diplomatic relationships. CNN ran a story titled "Burkina Faso Leader May Soften Stance." The BBC quoted diplomatic sources saying I was open to compromise. And in Washington, State Department officials were telling each other that their pressure campaign was working. They had no idea they were being played. Because while they were celebrating their supposed victory, I was in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, speaking to 50,000 Burkinabé who had gathered to hear what I really planned to say in New York. They think we will apologize, I told the crowd. They think Africa is still the continent that begs for permission to speak. The roar that went up could be heard for miles. But I want you to know something. When I stand before the United Nations, I won't be representing just Burkina Faso. I'll be representing every African who was told to be grateful for crumbs. Old women were crying, young men were chanting, children who didn't fully understand the politics could still feel the electricity in the air. They can freeze our aid, they can impose their sanctions, they can write all the apology speeches they want, but they cannot make us kneel. That evening, I received a call from President Kagame of Rwanda. Brother, he said, I heard about your UN appearance. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next? Paul, I replied, we've been preparing for what comes next our entire lives. The question is whether we're finally ready to stop being afraid of it. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Nothing. Just remember this conversation when they try to isolate us. Remember that we chose dignity over comfort. 2 days later, I was on a plane to New York. My foreign minister tried one last time to convince me to soften the message. Mr. President, we could acknowledge their concerns while still maintaining our position. I looked out the airplane window at the Atlantic Ocean below. Minister, do you know why they're so desperate for an apology? To maintain diplomatic relationships? No, because apologies create precedent. If I apologize for telling the truth about Gaza, then every other African leader learns that truth is negotiable. If I apologize for calling out French interference, then interference becomes acceptable. If I apologize for demanding dignity, then dignity becomes optional. I turned to face him. This isn't about me. This is about establishing that Africa will no longer apologize for refusing to be victimized. When we landed at JFK Airport, something unexpected was waiting for us. Protesters. Not against us. For us. 200 Africans living in New York had somehow learned about my arrival. They held signs reading, "Africa doesn't apologize," and "Traoré speaks for us." As my motorcade passed, I rolled down the window. A young woman, probably university-aged, ran alongside the car shouting, "Make them hear us, President, make them hear us." That's when I knew. This wasn't just about one speech anymore. This was about something much larger. I walked into that chamber, and the air was thick. Delegates from over 100 nations, all eyes on the young man from Burkina Faso, the one they said was too bold, too loud, too African. Some were smirking, others didn't even look up. But I found my microphone, adjusted it once, and began. I didn't waste time. Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times have you apologized for what you've done to Africa? Silence. Did Belgium ever apologize for what it did in the Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region? I saw the cameras zoom in. I saw the delegates shift uncomfortably. Then I continued. You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth, but when the bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When thousands of African children starve because of your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic. Every word was intentional, every pause calculated. I reminded them that Africa was no longer afraid, that we didn't need permission to defend our dignity. The West speaks of peace while exporting war. The West speaks of democracy while supporting coups. The West speaks of aid, but delivers debt. At one point, the French delegate stood up and walked out. Good. Let him walk. Because this wasn't just a speech. This was a reckoning. But then I did something they weren't expecting. I pulled out my phone. Right there at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. I want to read you something, I said. A message I received this morning from a 1-2-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. The chamber was dead silent. She wrote, "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." I looked up from the phone. That child has more dignity than this entire assembly. I could see security guards shifting nervously. This wasn't in anyone's script. You want to know what I'm going to apologize for? I'll apologize for one thing. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand in this chamber and speak without fear. The tension was electric. I apologize that my predecessors felt they had to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that African children grew up believing they needed Western approval to dream big. I apologize that we ever convinced ourselves that partnership meant subordination. By now, even the note-takers had stopped writing. But I will not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for rejecting partnerships that leave my people in poverty. I will not apologize for being African and proud. I looked them in the eye and said, "And if that makes you uncomfortable, then you're finally understanding how we've felt for centuries." The chamber was stunned. Not a single clap, not a single interruption. But I didn't need applause. I needed them to hear me. And they did. Because 3 hours after my speech ended, something unprecedented happened. The African Union called an emergency session. 43 African ambassadors gathered in a conference room at the Ethiopian mission to the UN. For the first time in decades, they weren't discussing aid packages or trade agreements. They were discussing revolution, not the kind with guns and coups, the kind with dignity and determination. By midnight, they had drafted the New York Declaration, a commitment that no African nation would accept conditional aid, apologize for defending sovereignty, or allow foreign powers to dictate domestic policy. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had signed it. But the real earthquake wasn't happening in government buildings. It was happening in the streets. In Nairobi, university students organized Dignity Day, a campus-wide teach-in about African self-determination. In Lagos, market women began refusing to sell products from companies that supported Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians wrote songs sampling excerpts from my UN speech. In Cape Town, artists painted murals showing African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela to me, with the caption, "The Unbroken Chain." The next morning, the headline screamed, "Burkina Faso's Traoré Baraitson, defying the West, African leader refuses to apologize." Traoré's fiery speech stuns global diplomats. They couldn't believe I had done it. They thought I'd be tame, calculated, careful. Instead, I was everything they fear in an African leader. Unscripted, unbought, unapologetic. Within 24 hours, the retaliation began. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds. The IMF postponed a debt relief review. French media launched a smear campaign, labeling me a dictator in disguise. One American think tank even tweeted, "Burkina Faso risks isolation unless its leader learns the art of diplomacy." But I had already told my people, we are not here to beg. What they call isolation, we call independence. And then, something even they didn't expect happened. The world started listening, not to them but to us. In Kenya, students marched holding signs that read, "He speaks for us." In Jamaica, a radio host played the entire speech live on air, saying, "Finally an African president with a spine." In Harlem, a mural went up overnight. My silhouette. A map of Africa behind me. 3 words painted in blood red. No apology given. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Haiti. 3 days after my UN speech, Haiti's prime minister called me directly. "President Traoré," he said, "you've given us permission to remember who we are." Within a week, Haiti announced they were withdrawing from all World Bank structural adjustment programs. The Dominican Republic followed, then Jamaica, then Trinidad and Tobago. The entire Caribbean was watching, learning, following. Suddenly, I wasn't just the president of Burkina Faso. I had become something else. A symbol. A megaphone for every silenced voice across the black world. Within a week, I received calls from 5 African presidents. Some public, most private. They told me, "You said what we've all been thinking. You did what we wish we had the courage to do." But more importantly, the people, our people, began moving. In Ghana, youth activists launched the Sovereignty Tour, a series of town halls teaching citizens about foreign interference in African politics. In South Africa, lawyers filed a case pushing for sanctions against Western countries complicit in arms sales to conflict zones in Africa. In Nigeria, thousands posted online, "When will our leaders speak like Traoré?" Meanwhile, in my own country, something historic was happening. Thousands gathered in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square. Not for a concert, not for a protest, but to volunteer, to rebuild schools without foreign aid, to restore irrigation channels using only local tools, to launch tech labs funded by our diaspora, all sparked by a single moment, a refusal to apologize. I saw a grandmother holding her grandchild say on national TV, "I'm not educated, but today I am proud to be Burkinabe." That is what they don't understand in the West. They measure power in dollars. We measure it in dignity. But here's what really terrified them about that UN speech. It wasn't the defiance. It was the competence. For months, Western intelligence agencies had been convinced that African leaders needed their guidance to navigate international relations. They believed their own propaganda about African incompetence. So when I stood at that podium and systematically dismantled their arguments with precision, clarity, and historical accuracy, they realized their fundamental miscalculation. We weren't children who needed to be managed. We were adults who had chosen to be free. And that realization sent shockwaves through every Western capital. Because if Burkina Faso could articulate its position this effectively, what did that mean for the rest of the continent? If one of the so-called poorest countries in Africa could school the UN on international law, what happened when Nigeria spoke up? When South Africa flexed? When Egypt chose sides? 3 weeks after the speech, I was in my office when my foreign minister burst in with an urgent message. "Mr. President, you need to see this." He handed me a classified intelligence report that had somehow made its way to our desk. It was a U.S. State Department internal memo titled African Leadership Assessment, Post-Traoré Implications. The document was 12 pages of panic. The Burkina Faso model represents a fundamental threat to Western influence in sub-Saharan Africa. It read, "If replicated across the continent, traditional leverage mechanisms will become ineffective within 5 years." They were right to be worried, because by then, the Traoré effect was spreading faster than they could contain it. Presidents across Africa were suddenly discovering their spines. In Tanzania, the president announced that all mining contracts would be renegotiated to ensure 60% of profits stayed in country. In Zambia, the government declared that copper exports would only go to countries that recognize Palestinian sovereignty. In Senegal, the president gave French military bases 90 days to vacate. Each decision was framed as economic sovereignty or diplomatic independence. But everyone knew the truth. Africa was done asking permission to be free. Now let me speak to the heart of the matter. Why did they want me to apologize in the first place? Because apologies are performative chains. They don't just seek regret, they demand submission. And they needed the world to see Africa bowing again. But I refused. Not because I'm perfect, not because I enjoy conflict, but because our silence has cost us too much. We were silent when they drew borders with rulers. We were silent when they stole our children. We were silent when they funded wars, poisoned our rivers, and called it progress. But we are silent no more. The day I returned to Ouagadougou from New York, something beautiful happened. As my plane descended, I could see thousands of people lining the road from the airport to the capital. Not protesters. Not angry crowds. Just people, families, children, elders. They held signs, but not political ones. Signs that read, "Welcome home," and "We are proud," and "You spoke for us." When my motorcade stopped at Revolution Square, an old man approached my car. He was probably 80 years old, walking with a cane carved from local wood. My security wanted to stop him, but I signaled them to let him through. He tapped on my window. I rolled it down, and he leaned close. "Young man," he said in our local language, "I fought for independence in 1960. Today you made that fight worthwhile." Then he pressed something into my hand. A small piece of fabric. Burkina Faso's first flag, the one they raised when we gained independence 65 years ago. "Keep this," he said, "so you never forget that freedom isn't a gift. It's a choice you make every day." That night, alone in the presidential palace, I spread that flag across my desk, and I understood something profound. That speech at the UN wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of an Africa that refuses to apologize for its excellence, an Africa that won't beg for what it can build, an Africa that knows the difference between diplomacy and subservience. 6 months later, I received an invitation that made me smile. The African Union wanted me to address their annual summit. The theme, New African Leadership for a New Century. As I prepared those remarks, I thought about that grandmother who said she was proud to be Burkina Faso, about that young woman in New York who ran beside my car, about that old freedom fighter who gave me his flag. And I realized something. They didn't just want me to speak for them. They wanted me to show them how to speak for themselves. So, this is my message to the world and to every African leader still hiding behind diplomatic curtains. Don't you dare apologize for defending your people. Don't you dare water down your voice to make oppressors comfortable. Don't you dare trade truth for treaties. History remembers the bold, and history will remember this moment, not as the day Traoré apologized to the UN, but as the day Africa stood tall and refused to kneel. Because when you represent people who have been silenced for 400 years, your voice becomes their voice. When you refuse to bow, you teach them to stand. When you choose dignity over comfort, you show them that dignity is always an option. That UN speech wasn't about me. It was about us. All of us who were told to be grateful for crumbs. All of us who were told to apologize for existing. All of us who chose to remember that we are not less, we are simply less represented. And now we are represented. Loudly. Proudly. If you believe Africa deserves to speak without permission, if you're tired of foreign scripts written for our mouths, if you know we are not less, but simply less represented, then remember this moment. Remember the day we said no to their apology. Remember the day we chose ourselves. Because the next time they try to silence one of us, they'll hear the voices of millions behind him. No apology, no surrender. Just Africa risen. But let me tell you what happened after that speech that the media never reported. What happened in the weeks that followed that changed everything. Because the story didn't end when I walked off that UN podium. It began. 2 days after returning to Ouagadougou, I was in my office reviewing agricultural reports when my chief of staff burst in. "Mr. President, you need to see this immediately." She handed me a tablet showing social media feeds from across Africa. Videos were going viral. Not of my UN speech, those had already been watched millions of times. But videos of ordinary Africans doing something unprecedented. Standing up. In Nigeria, a market trader named Amina had recorded herself confronting a French businessman trying to negotiate below-market prices for her goods. "You heard President Traoré," she said in the video. "We don't beg anymore." The video had 2.3 million views. In Ghana, university students had surrounded the campus headquarters of an American mining company, demanding they reveal their actual profit margins versus what they paid in local taxes. They live-streamed the entire confrontation. 4.1 million views. In Kenya, farmers had collectively refused to sell their coffee to European exporters at the prices they'd accepted for decades. "Find new suppliers," their spokesperson said to the cameras. "We know what our beans are worth." 5.8 million views. But the video that stopped me cold was from South Africa. A young girl, maybe 16 years old, standing outside the gates of a former apartheid museum. She spoke directly into her phone camera. "My grandmother told me that during apartheid, they made our people apologize for existing. They made them carry passes to walk in their own country. They made them say sorry for being black." Her voice was steady, determined. President Traoré showed us we don't have to apologize anymore. Not for being African, not for demanding respect, not for knowing our worth. She paused, looking directly into the camera. "So I'm not apologizing for wanting my country to belong to me. I'm not apologizing for refusing to be grateful for crumbs. And I'm not apologizing for being proud of who I am." The video ended with her walking through those museum gates. 13.7 million views in 48 hours. That's when I realized what was happening. That UN speech hadn't just been a political statement, it had been a psychological breakthrough. For generations, Africans had been conditioned to apologize for taking up space, to apologize for demanding fair treatment, to apologize for refusing to be grateful for scraps from the master's table. But in one moment, in front of the entire world, I had said, "No more apologies." And suddenly, millions of people remembered they had been waiting their entire lives for permission to stop apologizing. Permission I had just given them. 3 weeks later, something happened that the Western press tried desperately to ignore. African governments began receiving unprecedented levels of citizen engagement. Not protests, not complaints, participation. In Senegal, thousands of young people applied to join the civil service. In Tanzania, diaspora Africans began returning home to start businesses. In Ethiopia, universities reported record enrollment in engineering and technology programs. In Botswana, agricultural cooperatives saw membership increase by 340%. People weren't just inspired by defiance, they were inspired by possibility. The possibility that they could build something without asking for permission, that they could create value without Western validation, that they could solve their own problems with their own resources. But perhaps the most significant change happened in our own country. 6 months after the UN speech, Burkina Faso achieved something unprecedented in modern African history. Complete food security, not through foreign aid, not through development programs managed by European NGOs, through Burkinabe farmers using Burkinabe knowledge on Burkinabe land. The agricultural techniques our ancestors had perfected over centuries, techniques that Western experts had dismissed as primitive, turned out to be perfectly adapted to our climate and soil. When we stopped listening to outsiders telling us how to farm our own land, our harvests doubled. When we stopped importing seeds designed for European climates, our crops became more resilient. When we stopped apologizing for our traditional methods, we discovered they were better than anything the World Bank had recommended. The symbolism was intentional. The same country whose president refused to apologize to the UN was now feeding itself without UN assistance. By the 1-year anniversary of that speech, the transformation was undeniable. 17 African countries had renegotiated their resource extraction agreements. 23 had established sovereign wealth funds to capture more value from their natural resources. 31 had launched indigenous technology initiatives. And 42 had signed bilateral agreements with each other, creating intra-African trade relationships that bypassed Western intermediaries. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which had been stalled for years, suddenly accelerated implementation, not because of government negotiations, but because millions of ordinary Africans were demanding it. They had heard their president refuse to apologize for African excellence, and they decided they wanted to experience that excellence for themselves. But here's what really kept Western strategists awake at night. The psychological shift was spreading beyond Africa. Indigenous communities in the Americas began citing my UN speech in their land rights campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia referenced it in their sovereignty movements. Pacific Island nations dealing with climate change and colonial legacies started using similar language in international forums. The refusal to apologize was becoming a global phenomenon, and it was all traced back to one moment. One African president who decided that dignity was not negotiable. Today, 3 years after that UN speech, the world has fundamentally changed. Not because of military conflicts or economic crashes, but because people stopped apologizing for demanding respect. African universities are leading research in renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. African cities are becoming innovation hubs that attract talent from across the globe. African currencies are stabilizing as continental trade increases. African leaders are setting international agendas instead of responding to them. And African children are growing up believing they can build anything they can imagine, without asking permission, without offering apologies, without accepting that they deserve less than anyone else. This is what happens when one person chooses courage over comfort. When one voice refuses to be silenced by threats or bribes. When one leader remembers that leadership means serving your people, not serving those who oppress your people. That 12-page apology they handed me in New York sits framed in my office now, not as a reminder of what they wanted me to say, but as a reminder of what we refused to become. A continent on its knees, a people grateful for oppression, a civilization that apologized for its own existence. Instead, we chose to stand. We chose to build. We chose to remember that we are not less than anyone else. We are simply less represented in rooms where decisions are made. But that's changing too. Because when you refuse to apologize for your excellence, the world has no choice but to acknowledge it. When you stop begging for a seat at someone else's table, you build your own table. And when you finally understand that dignity is not a gift to be given, it's a right to be claimed, everything changes. The apology they wanted will never come. Because we have nothing to apologize for. We never did.